Well, hi, and welcome back to Mom's Mentoring. I'm Linda Reeb. And I think when we think of the topic today of the discipline of children, there are some things that we are wondering about. This is not an easy topic, and certainly not in today's world. I'm the mom of 3 grown children and the grandmother of 2. And we love watching our children grow and develop, don't we? Mentally, physically, emotionally, socially, and their soul, their spirit. And when you think of soul development, you think of things like character development and their spiritual values being formed. And the Bible normalizes discipline as part of the activity that happens in the development of our kids' souls. They have a spirit, they have a will, they have a decision-making process, and all of those things come into play when we think about the discipline. Part spiritual formation, part character development, it all is kind of woven together, and sometimes it's a little mysterious, isn't it? So let's read a couple of Bible verses to get started, because the Bible says a ton of stuff about discipline. Here's 2 of them. Discipline your children. You'll be glad you did. They'll turn out delightful to live with. That's encouraging. Proverbs 29:17. Now, Hebrews 12, verse 11, maybe takes a more pragmatic view. It says, at the time, discipline isn't much fun. Oh, so there's that. It always feels like it's going against the grain. Later, of course, it pays off handsomely. Hebrews 12, verse 11. I just love the Message Bible, the way it's just so candid in how it says stuff. At the time, discipline isn't much fun. And it can feel that way. The kids don't like it. The parents don't like having to administer it. It can be challenging. So today we're going to look at how does discipline fit into the development of our children's soul. Okay? And the paradox is that sometimes people feel like discipline is all about being punitive, punishment. And the paradox is that it's not, and that it's actually for our child's good. So let's shift our perspective a little bit away from punitive onto the idea of using discipline as a training tool for our children's good. A bit of a paradox, I know, but the Bible assures us that the discipline, though hard at the beginning, will pay off handsomely. So let's just trust that and go forward and say, well, what does that look like? What are we aiming for? So I would say that the things we want the kids to gain, among other things, we want limits, establishing limits, but maintaining connection, self-discipline, freedom under authority and respect for authority. Nobody wants to raise a little hellion who doesn't ever respect any kind of authority, a teacher, a police officer, any of the above, and the ability to live beyond themselves. We don't want to raise a kid who thinks they're the center of their universe and their whole frame of reference is me, myself, and I. That's too small of a world for that little person. And it's mean to not train and discipline a child to be able to have the capacity to live outside of themselves so that their little ego is not the controlling force in their world. So the discipline we want to administer gives the kids tracks to run on, limits, which gives a sense of safety, but within those limits, tons of freedom to be completely who they are. So we're going to deal with willfulness, self-will, bad attitudes, and we're going to encourage good choices, lots of love and connection, and watch the kids flourish. So the big question, of course, is like, that all sounds good. How are we going to do that? So let's unpack it. Limits. You may not. Have you ever said those words to your children? Mom, can I do such and such? Mm-hmm. What about this other? No. And I know sometimes we want to eliminate the word no from our vocabulary. So get creative and figure out other ways to say it. But basically you're setting a limit and saying, line in the sand right here. Child knows when they are seen and heard, but not allowed to be the center of the universe and sabotage the rest of the family. Their feelings will be respected, but limits will be set as to how those feelings are expressed. So what does that look like? Let's take temper tantrums when kids are little. Early on, you want to make sure there's connection. When a child is melting down, maybe they're only 1 or 2 years old, they need to know that when they're held hostage by their own emotions, that you're there for them. that's not the time perhaps to say, okay, you go to your room until you can settle down. If a child is going to create a pattern of having those kinds of temper tantrums, then it may be something that later on, when the child's not in the middle of a temper tantrum, that you say to them, hey, you know what, sometimes your emotions are too much for you, aren't they? And so when that happens, if it's the middle of the dinner table, we're going to make sure you have a safe place to be until you can feel better, and we're going to carry on with our dinner. And the child is free to express how they feel. They're free to rejoin the family with no recrimination, but they don't sabotage the entire family. And only you and your spouse can figure out what that looks like for you. Some kids are more compliant, some are strong-willed, some have 1 or 2 temper tantrums and that's it. Others have multiple ones every day. So that is something worth thinking about, is how do you maintain connection but not allow the family to be sabotaged? I think there's a good balance in there somewhere. And then just encouraging the child that sometimes when they have to be removed from the family circle for the sake of not creating havoc in the entire family, that you really think and hope and are praying that they'll be able to make a better choice next time. And that over time it'll get easier. And with God's help, you can pray about it with your child. There's just so many ways to address that. So, a rupture and repair cycle can happen in the family. The child misbehaves, it gets dealt with, they're reassured of the parent's love, and life goes on. And so I love that idea of rupture and repair. Rupture and repair. And the ruptures do not need to cause irreparable damage, but the child is welcomed back into the family circle, loved, cared for, even when they've had a blowout. So I think the other thing is that it's good for parents, for those of us on the administering discipline side of things, to admit when we've done or said something wrong and we're in need of a do-over, as we're encouraging our little people and saying, hey, you know what? You are going to have this consequence for that behavior, and I hope you'll choose better next time. And then let's have a do-over and start again. And sometimes we need that, don't we? And so admitting to our kids when we've done wrong can be a real helpful thing. The children get to see that rupture and repair cycle is part of life, all your life through. It's not just for when you're a little person. Okay, second thing, self-discipline. There's external discipline imposed on a child. We want them to learn how to internalize that. And when they're young, then early, consistent, simple, non-angry, declarative, here's the line in the sand, are things that they can understand. They don't need to be afraid of the parents, and the parents don't need to be afraid of the children either in that setting. I've known plenty of parents who just felt like, oh, my child is so out of control, I don't dare cross her because, what happens when that happens is not pretty. And so I think with a gospel-centered form of discipline, you can really pray and ask God, Lord, help me not to be afraid of my own children. Help me to stand firm, and when I set a limit, help me to say what it is, to know what it is, to be sure of it, to be no fear and declarative and yet kind. And help me to stand true, to come up with consequences that are age appropriate and activity appropriate, to match the consequences. You know, when you speed, you get a speeding ticket. And when you have, your alarm doesn't go off, if you're endlessly late for work, you get fired. Life just teaches us reality stuff. And so as we're doing consequences with our children, especially when they're young, just a simple reality consequence. They're going to cry, they're not going to like it, but they'll learn. And you can always come back to, I hope you'll choose better next time. I'm sorry that you chose this time to not obey mommy, and as a result, you've lost this privilege. I hope you'll choose better next time. I think that's in line with fairness and with reality discipline. And the little ones can understand that. They know when things are fair. Even if they don't like what you impose on them, they know when it's fair. And then you have to decide childishness versus defiance. When a kid knocks over a glass of milk, that's not defiance. They're just being kids, right? And so pick your battles. Know which things require that extra training or sometimes a consequence. What you may consider something punitive, so that they learn a lesson, so that next time they have the option to choose better, because they're remembering that, when I respond like that, or when I tell that lie, or when I hit my baby sister, it doesn't go well for me. And so I'm going to choose better this time. Make allowances for your little people, but don't make excuses. Little kids are super smart, and when they're 2 years old, they are more than ready to be able to understand that no means no and yes means yes. They won't like it when you say no, but they understand it. They're smart little critters. And then timeout can be a helpful thing as well. Kids' little emotional systems get overloaded. Mine gets overloaded at age 58. So sometimes mama needs a timeout, not just the kids. And there's lots of different ways. We'll talk about spankings in a few minutes. The 1, 2, 3 style of administering discipline. I knew a mom, she used to sit her little kid down in a rocking chair when they were, getting on her last nerve and starting to really whoa, we got to deal with this. And she'd say, you sit there and think about it before you cross the last bridge to trouble. I'd never heard that one before. And then for yourself, mothers of many styles, you get to choose whether you're going to discipline this way, A, B, C, or whether you're going to discipline this way, X, Y, Z. Are you going to discipline for first-time obedience? Some people think that's the greatest thing ever. Other people are like, no, I'm going to work with my child. I'm going to explain. I'm going to give them chances. We're going to talk about options and choices. And they have a different style of how they do that. The Bible doesn't officially say, do the 1, 2, 3 method or do the timeout and consequences method, but it does say discipline your children. So you do get to kind of weigh and choose some of those things. And boy, you just have one kid, you finally feel like you're figuring it out a little bit, and then guess what? God blesses you with another child, totally different, and maybe system A does not work with child B. So this whole raising children keeps us on our toes, keeps us on our knees saying, God, I need your help and wisdom for this. And then there can be a lot of things too from your family of origin. So talk to your spouse. I know families where somebody says, I will never spank my child. I was spanked as a child and it did not go well and I'm still in therapy because of it. And fair, right? Fair. So, okay, you're not going to spank. Well, what are you going to do? So we need a plan. So I think just talking about it with your spouse, talking about it with your peers a little bit, do some research, read some good Christian books about different perspectives. Just be open to which way God nudges you. You might be surprised. You may say, I am going to spank, and then find God nudging you in a different direction, or vice versa. So I think being open to that is good. I'll tell you a little story about loss of privileges. This was our daughter Jenny when she was probably 4 or 5, so not a wee tiny, but just in those early middle years. And she was being a brat in the car on the way up to Pennsylvania. We had an 8-hour drive to go visit family. And we finally just had reprimanded her a couple of times, tried to get her to settle down, used distraction techniques. And then we said, Jenny, you know what? If you keep doing that, when we get to Grandpa and Grandma's, you're going to stay in the car for 10 extra minutes. After we all get out and are playing with the cousins, you will still be in the car. Maybe she was a little older than that, because I don't know if a 4-year-old has a concept of 10 minutes. But anyways, 10 minutes is a long time when you're just a little person. And so she was bratty. We got to Pennsylvania. I'll never forget her little face up against the car window. Hands, face, nose. For 10 minutes she watched the other kids playing with the cousins, having the most fun. The dogs were having a great... Oh my word. But here's the deal. She was smart. And from then on, when we said in the car, Jenny, don't be a brat or you're going to pay with this consequence, she was like, that was the end of the brattiness. So that was we felt like that one was a score. Who knows? But it didn't always work quite like that smoothly. But that was an interesting story about Jenny. Keep a written list of consequences if you need to. Every mom I've ever met says, God, right in the middle of the heat of this kid misbehaving, I can't think what to say. If you do this, you're going to have to lose what privilege, or get this chore added on, or do without some neat thing we were going to have at dinner time, or their mind goes blank. So I had to do that back in the day. Make a list. Just make a list. And it just helps. You don't have to think everything through every single time. Use that as a tool. Make sure that consequences you choose are too bad for you, for the child. it's too bad for you that you have to suffer that consequence right now. I hope you'll choose better next time. Don't make it too bad for the mom. Like if you have to keep track of a whole lot of things, who's allowed to watch TV shows or not, or this or that, what time they have to go to bed now as a result of, if you have more than 1 or 2 children, that is exhausting. So try to make sure it's too bad for you when you come up with a consequence. And then if you decide that spanking is going to be one of the tools in your toolbox, people always think of spanking as a punitive thing. I think of it more as a training thing. So that's definitely a shift in perspective, isn't it? If you're frustrated and you're like, stop, and finally whack, and you give a kid a whack, that's punitive, right? That's a swat, that's a hot pocket, whatever you want to call it. That's not a spanking. So I think I would just caution people to say, if you're going to spank, if that's one of the tools in your toolbox, spank early, infrequently, and make sure that it's a true spanking. And so Chip Ingram has some really great spanking guidelines on focus on the family that are helpful. If this is new to you or you feel like you weren't spanked well, refresh your memory on some of that stuff and just see if God directs you to being open to something like that. When you are going to use that as a tool in your arsenal, talk about it with your child ahead of time and say, you know what, sometimes when you do what's wrong, mommy needs to train you to do the right thing so that you learn to obey. And part of that training will be that sometimes you will get a spanking. And here's what it will look like. And this is what it will mean. And this is why I'm doing it. And it's for your good. And I don't enjoy giving you a spanking, but I feel like this is part of training you to become obedient, to learn to submit to mom and daddy's authority and ultimately to God's authority. And so it needs to be explained ahead of time. Let a child know that it's coming and what it involves. You're going to have 3 smacks on your butt. Make sure that when you spank, they feel it and it feels like something that they wish they weren't getting and that they don't want to repeat again in a hurry. Don't just pop their little diaper and they don't really feel anything, but there's all the emotional sort of shock factor of, oh, mommy's hitting me or something. It's not meant to be about that at all. So it has to be done well and done carefully. And then pray with the child and ask for God's help that the child will learn to obey and to not repeat that behavior. And then express love and let the child know that you love them, you care about them, and then when it's over with, it's over with. They are completely in your good favor. There's no ongoing nagging or scolding. That's the cool thing. Like both my husband and I felt like we were spanked well in our families of origin. And so we used it some as an arsenal, a tool in our toolbox when our kids were little. But the cool thing with it is when you are teaching a child not to do a certain behavior, it was a helpful early intervention so that the child learned when mommy says that, she means it. And when I don't obey, here's the consequence. And it was something the child did not like and wished to not repeat. And so they quickly learned that there were certain things that really mattered. And it was in their best interest to obey. And so what it did was it created some harmony in the home because there was less nagging, scolding, bribing, saying, please don't, hey, what, I told you already, don't, no, don't, and escalated voices and angry faces and all the things that go along with nagging and screaming. And that can also wear a parent down, particularly if it's the mom who's home with the little people all day long, if there's an endless stream of hostility and conflict and nagging and scolding and please and reprimanding. I just found that I wouldn't recommend spankings being the only tool in your toolbox, but at an early age, they were an effective tool that we found to be helpful to create a climate where a child learned quickly where the limits were, and then within those limits had all sorts of freedom to just totally be themselves and be wild and crazy like kids like to be, but knowing they had a certain security in knowing that if they pushed past those limits, they were going to be met with authority, loving authority, but that we weren't going to back down and let them just be either the center of the universe or wild animals that just did what they want, when they want, with no consequences. So that's all I have to say about that. Okay, what else? Prayer. Praying is a big deal. when it comes to how do I discipline my children. You want to believe it. You want your children to have respect for authority and to be willing to live under your authority, ultimately under God's. And so that's where the gospel message weaves into this whole thing as well, that a child gets to hear that, you know what, you did wrong, but we do wrong. We are sinners, but God loves us anyways, and that's why Jesus came. And then we can ask God for his help, and he forgives us, and we get do-overs, and he promises he'll come alongside and help us. And so that whole message, it can sound like a bad news message to say to a little child that they're a sinner, but it's true. And it's good news because God already knows that about us. And so when they misbehave, guess what? They're just doing what comes naturally. We're sinners. We do not want to live under authority. We resent that. We fight against it. We rebel. And a 2-year-old does every bit as much as a 60-year-old person does.